operationalization of the cyber norms. And now, while it's states that have committed to be guided in their behavior by the 11 norms, many of them, as you know, require cooperation with other actors. And these webinars really explore the lessons learned and the good practices in these relationships, particularly as both the cyber processes underway at the UN, the GGE, and the OEWG are considering what guidance could be useful to help states operationalize the 2015 norms. Now, the first webinar explored interagency cooperation in norms implementation, and we used two countries as an example for that, France and Mexico. And today we're going to look at how different actors create an enabling environment for implementation of the 2015 norms. You are all certainly familiar with the considerable number of public-private multi-stakeholder initiatives that promote the 2015 norms, as well as work towards their implementation. And it's often that these are the ones that come to mind when we are considering private sector cooperation with states on things like vulnerability disclosure and supply chain security. However, with the importance of things like e-commerce and telemedicine, cloud computing, and other digital services are rising around the world, and with the current pandemic has really brought this to the fore with a massive shift to online education and teleworking, increased online service provision by both our governments and businesses. And all of this depends on an open, secure, and stable ICT environment. So rather than jumping directly to looking at the more visible kind of level of cooperation between states and the private sector on norms implementation, first we're going to look at something that sometimes is maybe inadvertently neglected or goes a little bit unseen below the waterline, and that's ensuring that there is a functioning, robust, and secure technical environment for our public and private sectors to work in. So today we're going to hear from two experts who have been working on advancing the ICT norms and thus creating this enabling digital environment from different angles. So first we have Johanna Weaver. She's the GGE expert from Australia, and she's head of the Australian delegation to the OEWG. And in her day job, she is special advisor to the Australian ambassador for cyber affairs. Now, Australia is a great case for us to start with. Digital technologies continue to power Australia's economic growth. According to Deloitte, the contribution of digital things to the country's GDP is expected to grow 40% by 2023, just a few years from now. So in Australia, we see strong digital economic growth coupled with leadership in cybersecurity policy issues at the international level. But Australia is also a regional leader as well, so it seems only appropriate that we bring in a voice who can speak to a regional dimension, as strengthening the enabling environment does not stop at one's borders, but it has a positive spillover effect to one's neighbors in one's region and beyond. So to help us from that perspective, we have Pablo Hinojosa, Director of Strategic Engagement at the Asia Pacific Network Information Center, APNIC, and a member of their executive team. So just maybe some people might be less familiar with APNIC, so let me just say it's a nonprofit based in Australia, and it serves the whole Asia Pacific region. It is a membership-based body organization whose members include internet service providers, telecommunication providers, data centers, universities, banks, internet registries, et cetera, et cetera. So these, again, are the enablers, that those who support maybe below the waterline in our day-to-day operations, but we certainly notice when that enabling environment, there's something wrong with it. So it's really important that we get that perspective into this conversation as well. So a few housekeeping notes. Our time is limited today. We're really going to focus on the practical lessons learned about creating an enabling environment and the relationships that are necessary to do so. I'm sure that both Johanna and Pablo have lots to share on this topic. Throughout the webinar, of course, we really welcome and encourage your questions. We'd ask you that you submit them via the chat function. And of course, we really appreciate it when you identify yourself, your name, your title, when you ask a question, and we'll try to weave those into the conversation as we go along. So with that out of the way, I think we're going to jump right into the good stuff. I can see Pablo. I don't see Johanna. Maybe she's joining us. She's here somewhere lurking, perhaps.
I'm here. My camera is on. Hopefully you can hear me.
All right. So we're at least somewhat, there we are. And we have Pablo here as well. All good. So if we can get Pablo unmuted as well, we're going to start this conversation. Maybe just to help contextualize where we're going to start. Let me ask you both to maybe give me like the 30-second elevator pitch, like just real brief, on how you see your organization's role in norms implementation. Like Pablo, what does APNIC do vis-a-vis norms implementation?
There are different ways to take this approach for sure. So what we do in terms of norms implementation is probably very different to what most governmental experts at the UN think about norms implementation. Our norms in the technical community are certainly different and come from different perspectives, but there are many best practices at the operational level of the internet. And I think one of the questions that we need to help to bridge is how those norms that have been or are being evolved in the UN arena at the very high political level eventually sort of come to earth and will affect or have an effect of the behaviors online that you can perceive in the monitors and in the dashboards of, for example, network operators or the computer emergency response teams. And that is an interesting perspective. What do you perceive as online behavior, right? And the network operators and the CERT community have a very precise, very concrete, practical notion of what is that. It is measured in terms of traffic, in terms of the flow of packets between networks, in terms of pathways and routes, in terms of malware code inside certain applications, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, I would say that there would be a meeting point that we need to draw when we're talking about implementation of the UNGGE norms and how that affects that moving of packets between different networks.
Well, that's really helpful. I think we forget very easily that it is these sorts of operators who witness the behavior that we talk about, right? We talk about norms of responsible state behavior, there's criminal behavior online and all of that, but you're really at the front row seat for seeing the behavior, which argues very well for greater cooperation in this translation from the high level down to the people who are witnessing it in their day-to-day work. How about you, Johanna? I mean, what is the role of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in norms implementation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating point and very much linked to what Pablo was saying. Most of the implementation of these norms of responsible state behavior come down to other organizations domestically in Australia and the private sector. So there are certainly norms that DFAT is very focused on in terms of the implementation. So if you look at the first norm on you should have good international cooperation, that's one we're obviously vested in. The second norm looking at attribution, considering all relevant information, we play a role there. And in some of the norms around responding to requests for assistance are also norms that we are involved in terms of implementation. But actually, what I see DFAT's role, DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, is primarily in terms of implementation, is capturing the implementation that is going on domestically in Australia and capturing the work that is already, that is the cooperation that is going on across many different organizations. So I think there's often a perception that these norms, well, yes, they were agreed and negotiated by diplomats in the UN in 2015, but those diplomats didn't pull these norms out of nowhere. What they actually did is look at, well, what is best practice in this field? And then we have articulated that in the 2015 report, which we're now looking to implement. So every country is actually, in most instances, already doing things. And certainly the private sector and many organizations like Pablo's are very much at the forefront of implementing these norms that, that we have articulated in the 2015 GG report.
You know, that's an excellent point, this idea of capturing implementation. And maybe you both could speak to this briefly. You can only kind of capture if you're aware of what the norms are, right? And that's been a criticism that we've heard for the last few years, that the 2015 norms were not well promoted, weren't well socialized, kind of on a systematic dimension. They were maybe socialized unevenly in different communities and maybe in different regions as well. So can you speak a little bit to that, about maybe the challenge of capturing and how one goes about raising awareness? Because as Johanna pointed out, some of these norms, states are already demonstrating these behaviors, whether they recognize it or not, or whether they think they claim credit for it. Like, oh yeah, we're doing that. They might not know that they're actually should be getting more credit for it. So could you both speak a little bit to that? Maybe Pablo, could you start?
I mean, I'll just throw a teaser for a later conversation, but it is about capacity building, right? And I think capacity building is something very important, because it is the way in which, for example, the technical community can learn to understand the language of these norms and the processes that gave birth to it, and how, what are the motivations and the mindsets, because they are very different. And at the same time, there is capacity that needs to be built in order for sort of the cyber diplomats to understand that these norms eventually may have an effect in the operation of networks. And I don't think there is a meaningful effect of these norms if we don't find feasible solutions to operationalize them one way or another in the actual sort of management of networks. So that capacity is needed to help bridge these two parts. But you were also saying, Johanna, that there have been contemplations about different communities in the process of building these norms. And while that might have happened one way or another, still the mindset of international law and a very state-centric or state-focused discussions in terms of international security has been the core drive of it. And these mindsets in this discipline have certain assumptions, for example, assumptions about trust, that usually states don't trust each other, so therefore there is a need to do that. And that assumption is, for example, different in the technical or the internet realm as well. Just one example about the popularization of these norms and how communities are now getting more aware about their existence and whether they will be affected or not. It's the norm about certs, right? So in 2017, I was part of a really good collaboration with different academic people and the CERT community, and there were also people from the governmental group of experts there. So it was a good group in the context of the Internet Governance Forum. So we ran a workshop. The workshop was called International Cooperation Between CERTs, the Technical Diplomacy for Cybersecurity. And during the workshop, the CERT representatives shared that they have developed extensive international networks of cooperation, that these networks are mostly informal communication channels to exchange information. which is critical for responding or resolving cybersecurity incidents. And we brought into the discussion whether they were aware of these norms. And obviously, we need to consider that there are many different types of certs. There are government-led national certs, and there are also sectorial certs in different industries, financial or even the network operators as well. But most of them were not aware of the development or the existence of this norm. And they were wondering whether sort of it made even sense to them that they cataloged behavior around it and what would be their eventual role to implement these, and how this norm may eventually help protect their function or their operation. So it was a very good debate, because it was the academics thinking whether there is science diplomacy in the CERT operation, then the governmental experts sort of saying whether CERTs are part of the diplomatic toolkit, and the CERTs basically saying, please don't politicize sort of the work that we do, because it's very important that we maintain these informal, trusted networks for sharing information. So, so that's just one example about it.
It's really good that you brought that example up, because I think we're going to circle back to that in a second. I particularly like this issue about scientific or technical diplomacy and trust. And Johanna, can we just close down on the capturing conversation? Would you like to touch on that before we move on to certs in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also a question that Bart has put in terms of what norms are we actually talking about? Can we clarify that? And I think it's actually a really important point, because even the word norms means different things to Pablo's community than it does to the community that I work in. So in this context, we are very specifically talking about the 11 norms that were articulated in the 2015 GGE report. And that does bring with it a different context. I think your point, Kirsten, about the level of awareness for these norms, and Pablo, something that you also mentioned, you know, many of the CERT community, when you were talking to them, weren't even aware that there was this norm. And that is a real indictment upon those of us who have been involved in this process, that we must get out, we must socialize it more. And I think this is, if I can articulate one objective that Australia has had through these processes, it has actually been to build awareness in Australia, but also more broadly of the fact that these norms exist, and to then collate the information in terms of what we are already doing to implement it. So as an example, as part of our open-ended working group submission, we actually pulled together examples of what Australia is doing to implement each one of those norms. Now, I can tell you, if I had have gone out to Australian government agencies and said to the Australian government agencies, can you please tell me what you're doing to implement Norm J of the 2015 GGE report, I would have got a nil return. Because the awareness of what those norms necessarily are is not there. We're building it, we're working on it. But what I had to do was actually look through the knowledge that we have in terms of what the domestic framework in Australia is, prepare a draft, send it out, and then get comments on it. So I think this really goes to the point of we need to work to increase awareness of what has already been agreed. We're doing some work on that, even basic things. So Bart from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who's the person who posed that question, has developed some fabulous norms icons, which are just, you know, the 11 norms, what are they, so that we can start to build that base level of knowledge. And that is actually really important. Oh, it doesn't work with your fancy. Yeah, there you go. And watch this space. We will be doing some more activity around those icons shortly. But that socialization problem or challenge is actually, in a way, it makes our task it makes the task seem much bigger than it actually is. Because when you say to people, here's 11 norms, you need to implement them, it's very different to there is 11 norms, you are already implementing them, what can we do to do that better? So I think it's incumbent on us to be getting out and to articulate those more broadly.
Yeah, I think it's much less daunting when people recognize they're not starting from being behind, actually.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Well, let's drill down into one of the 11 norms specifically, and Pablo has already mentioned certs, so I think that's a great one. Let's drill down into that one. Now, this is the norm from 2015 that says states should not knowingly support activity that would harm a computer emergency response team of another country, and that states shouldn't use their certs for malicious international activity. Now, certs are certainly a super important part of this digital enabling environment that we've been talking about, and we sometimes even call them our first responders in the digital environment. So they are critical, primary importance to a safe and secure digital environment. So Johanna, from a government perspective, this is a negative obligation, right? So yeah, as a negative norm, what would you say are good practices in operationalizing it? I mean, it's one of those challenging things to say. How do you operationalize a negative norm?
Well, I think there's a lot that you can do. First of all, the point Pablo was making, this is about building trust. And so with the CERT community, the basis of this norm is that we need to protect the certs in the same way that we recognize that we need to protect the first responders in the physical world, our ambulances, our hospitals, etc. And it's vital that they, regardless of what is going on, that they have that protection. So I think at a government level, there's a lot that we can do in terms of making public commitments, declarations that we will not engage in this type of activity. And that is one very important part of it. But it's also about building relationships and networks between government agencies that work in incident response, but then also looking at, okay, so we will have the CERT community, and as Pablo said, there are many different types of certs. There's national certs, but many countries have sectoral certs, for example, or just private sector certs that sit within large organizations. So have you got means of communication for those certs? And one of the key concerns that I hear about this norm is, well, we don't want to politicize the work of certs. And actually, if anything, this is the purpose of this norm is to say, absolutely, the cooperation among certs must be protected above all else. And if we also contextualize this, these norms are norms in the context of international peace and security. So issues, if we want to be dramatic, issues of war and peace. So this norm is applying not necessarily all the time on a day-to-day basis, but it's saying when you have a situation of crisis, we need to make sure that we are protecting those certs. And I think it's crossing a little bit over into one of the other norms on information sharing or responding to requests for assistance. But it's really important that you have those cert networks, the information exchange, the technical community working together. For the most part, that will happen without interaction from, say, the higher or the political level, if you like. But in those instances where you have a very specific incident that's happening, you need to make sure that the CERT communities can be also communicating with the political level to avoid escalation to crisis. And if you don't have those communication links in place beforehand, and that it's not something that you've exercised, for example, it is the real risk that a situation will escalate where it might otherwise have been able to be de-escalated through that communication. But the depoliticization is making sure that we keep it unpolitical is a key objective through this.
It's interesting. We're going to follow on with Pablo on that. I think it's interesting the point you made about how the norms are interrelated And for example, bringing up, there's the protection of critical infrastructure. There's the issue of offering assistance when requested. You've just brought up the issue of points of contact, which isn't a norm, but it's certainly a guidance that's been recommended in previous GGE reports, the importance of having points of contact and having them in different communities. And, and how do we go about building the relationships between the different communities so that people know who to call and are able to exercise that. It's one thing to have a phone book and be able to look up somebody's name. It's another thing to know somebody as well. So Pablo, turning to you, you started talking about this, and Johanna has already mentioned it, but this idea of concerns in, for example, the CERT community of being seen as perhaps a tool in a diplomatic toolbox and therefore politicizing the work. And that might actually hamper the technical work that needs to be done. And so can you talk a little bit about that? How does the technical community see operationalization of this norm once they are aware that it exists? Is it reassuring to know that governments commit not to attack and also not to use their own? I mean, is that in a way should be a reassuring initial trust building sort of step? How much cooperation between the technical community and, for example, the diplomatic side of the house is necessary? How much is possible? How much is desirable for everyone to be able to do their work well?
I think this is just starting, and it is very soon to tell. While the first committee and the governmental group of experts have had different iterations throughout the years and had already a long life, fact of the matter is that cyber issues are just starting to get more attention from non-state and, for example, the technical community. So it's very early in the process, and again, I think there is a lot of work to do to bridge both communities into some sort of first awareness that this norm development is happening, that some agreements have been reached, that there are some initial intentions towards implementation, and that there are very initial approaches to open up for consultations. One example is the one that Johanna undertook here in Australia, which was a very interesting exercise. We can also talk about it. And one exercise that we started doing just last year, also with the cyber diplomats and the technical community, was to run these norms through different cyber attack scenarios. So we started by thinking about sort of the cyber attack in Estonia in 2007, or the Bangladesh SWIFT heist in 2016, WannaCry and NotPetya ransomware attacks in 2017. And we put sort of these norms, for example, the one about request for assistance. And we said, sort of, in these scenarios, when you were dealing with these issues, for example, the CERT community or the network operators that were sort of under stress and responding on these major issues affecting their infrastructure, the accessibility of their services, and then the whole spillover effect over other areas of the economy. So they looked at these incidents and they started to think, well, I'm not sure this norm actually would have helped us a lot. And actually, their initial thinking was that, for example, requests for assistance may introduce some unnecessary latency on already established mechanisms of communication. And how to sort that out? Do you need to officialize those requests necessarily? Do you need to wait until you receive a memo from an accredited point of contact to do something? And there was this discussion about, well, that was not the intention, but then what is the process in which you would explain the operationalization of these norm, and how you are able to engage fruitfully with the technical community, saying, well, there is no intention to harm or to slow your ongoing processes that might work well. But actually, we will need these and these issues, information, or establishment of points of contact in order to de-escalate or prevent escalation of different issues. And it would be good to maintain these channels sort of well established before sort of these incidents occur again. And that's how the conversation starts. But again, I think it's very soon to tell because there hasn't been proper engagement between the communities so far as I would think.
I think we can circle back to this importance of building trust between the communities and how practically speaking, we can go about building those relationships. I think those are really key points. But I wanted to follow up immediately on something you brought up, which were Australia's multi-stakeholder consultations and consultations at a national level. Johanna, Australia is one of a small number of countries that's organized public consultations seeking inputs on its cyber policy positions. And I imagine that went to the private sector, to industry, to sectors, to individuals, to civil society. They were really open consultations. So could you tell us a little bit more about the decision, how the decision was made to have those sorts of consultations, and how interested were the private sector and others in being part of this enabling ecosystem and responding to a call for inputs?
So I think the starting point or the origin for the consultations, we have our Ambassador for Cyber Affairs, Tobias Viken, who comes from a background from not within government. And he has, for the last 4 years that he's been in the position, been a very, very strong advocate of making sure that we are engaging with the broader community because it force multiplies our efforts, and there is a huge amount of knowledge and expertise that lies in those communities. So our default position through all of the engagement that we do now is that we look to engage broadly with the multi-stakeholder community. And the question, though, in terms of how much interest and take up on that, I think, we were very clear in our consultations that we weren't just opening it up to Australian organisations. We did have some Australian responses, but a lot of the responses were actually international partners who were looking for an opportunity to provide that feedback. And again, I think that points to two things. One, I think a general hesitancy or question mark about within the private sector, etc., around UN processes in general, not necessarily related to this process, but you sort of talk about the UN and people's eyes glaze over a little bit sometimes. And then there is also, this is still a relatively specialized community of people that we're talking to in terms of the cyber community. And it was also interesting too, we received input. We were very we had crafted questions very clearly and what we were looking for. And then we held a round of public consultations. And it actually wasn't until we'd had the public consultations and the face-to-face conversations that we then had another round of input, which was the input that I was particularly looking for in terms of what is it that the private sector, civil society, academia sees in terms of best practice norm implementation. And that had very specific advice and guidance, very much informed a submission that I've made to the group of governmental experts in terms of commentary on the norms and then examples of best practice. That document has just been published online on DFAT's website. And the associated document, which is the compilation of input that we received from the multi-stakeholder community, will be online hopefully tomorrow, if not tomorrow, shortly thereafter. It's with our upload folks for web publishing. But I think the point with this is there's a wealth of knowledge and expertise. It's finding it and tapping into it and telling people that we're interested and being able to explain why they should be interested in what we're doing.
So we go back to communication, being able to, why does everyone have a dog in this fight? And what's the incentive for them to participate in this conversation? So if a government came to you, Johanna, and asked you for advice, one of your colleagues on another delegation asked you for advice about, wanting to set up their own national consultation process on these norms and their implementation, what would be your top do and your top don't? I mean, what's a concrete piece of advice you would give one of your colleagues?
I think there is no point just putting out a piece of paper. If you do that, no matter how beautifully worded it is, and we like to make beautifully worded documents, the responses are not necessarily going to be there. And I think it goes back to that communication, building a community, building trust and value. So I would strongly encourage face-to-face or virtual face-to-face mechanisms for a conversation before you're then seeking input. Because I think if you're just seeking input, people are skeptical. Governments have public consultations, and people put a lot of effort in, and then maybe they don't necessarily see the impact. So it's about building that trust and explaining to people how their input is going to be used. And why it is therefore worthwhile. So I think that in my experience, without having done that, it was you don't get as strong results. And certainly, the few organisations that had provided responses that responded to the beautifully worded questions that I had put in the first round were all organisations with whom I had had outreach and engagement with previously.
Interesting. So it really is about creating a relationship, not just one-off thing. Now, Pablo,
and I think that's sorry to interrupt. I'd just say I think that's something that really came out very clearly in a lot of the work that Pablo has done with some of his colleagues from the technical community. Is this has to be a conversation. So I can't claim credit for that. That comes from Pablo.
That's a great, thank you, Johanna. That's a great segue, because I was going to ask Pablo, you're in a very interesting position, I think, because you are really familiar with the political side of the conversation, and yet then you pivot and you're translating that back to another community who's not. So you're really in this bridging function, right, between service providers and especially private sector service providers and others, and bringing that conversation and kind of serving as a conduit back and forth. So I know that APNIC participated in the first, for example, OEWG consultation. You obviously dealt with the national consultations in Australia as well. So based on your experience with these sorts of asking for input or having opportunities to input into the political conversation, what do you see as the value of having this technical expertise, participating in these sorts of consultations when we're talking about transitioning from developing new norms to actually implementing the existing ones we have? How can regional enablers like APNIC help prepare others in your community to participate or to be implementers in their own right?
The first thing to say is that it is difficult, and we are learning a lot through times. And when the Australian government opened the door through this consultation, obviously we thought a lot whether to participate or not, but we ultimately ran into, well, we don't have a lot of opportunities to talk and to provide our views. And we had, for example, a lot of views on capacity building, which is at our heart in promoting the development of the internet in Asia Pacific. Most of our activities are in capacity building. And and we did it with a note saying this is not specifically for informing the Australian position, because we are also a regional organization, right? So our points of view were open to whoever would like to listen to them, not only for the Australian government. And I also wondered, Johanna organized a conversation, a dialogue, a seminar, webinar after that, which was very interesting as well, because it was very evident that the contributions to the public consultation, to the very carefully worded questions that she put out, that these contributions were from all over the place, and were not narrow, and were not answering the questions that Johanna asked directly. And I wondered, and I said that during that seminar, whether it was for only the Australian government to absorb all of these contributions into its position, or is it, I mean, most of these contributions were more from the whole UNGGE and the UNOEWG process to absorb, because there were a lot of companies and organizations that are very interested into these processes that have not been able to put forward any views, and that this government opened the door through a consultation, then they went in, and it was not necessarily sort of helpful for contributing to the national position of Australia. So how could these consultations sort of affect or influence sort of both the norm development process or the norm implementation process? And I think we don't have the whole answer to that yet. And it is difficult as well. I don't claim success in terms of bringing the internet community on board into these. These processes are still very difficult to grasp, understand, and particularly because they come from completely different set of assumptions and mindsets, and it is not very clear whether eventually they will affect or not the practical operation of networks.
It's really useful, though, I think what you both are saying about, by having a national consultation, which wasn't limited to just Australia, it really opened a door, and perhaps a much more approachable way than saying, oh, there's going to be a multi-stakeholder meeting in New York for the OEWG, never heard of that, don't know what that acronym stands for, et cetera, et cetera. And so it diffuses this information and socializes it in a different way. And for, you know, to be told, you know, I value your input, tell us what you think for the first time, is a very liberating and exciting thing for different sectors. So I can understand that it would be all over the place, but it's also encouraging, it might encourage other states to do it as well, because we ultimately, since this enabling environment and all of these sectors are involved, the more that we have aware of these processes and aware that our governments are concerned about the international security dimension of building these networks, again, the more we're going to socialize, the more we're going to develop networks, we're going to get communities of interest, and we're going to see that we are capturing, as you said, Johanna, more of the norms. So I think all of those are really useful things to think about if a government wants to consider holding its own sorts of national consultations. Maybe we could, yeah.
I just very briefly say that the responses that we've received, we will also be submitting to the open-ended working group as a paper, because exactly this point that Pablo is saying, these positions that have been put forward are not unique positions for Australia to take forward. It's things that the multi-stakeholder community would very much like to see reflected in either the open-ended working group or the GG report. So I'll be sharing that document, which will be publicly available online, but also submitting it to the open-ended working group and circulating it to my GG counterparts as well.
Yeah, that might also encourage other experts on the GGE who do serve in individual capacities, but obviously they come from a variety of states. It might encourage those GGE experts to perhaps also do some sort of public consultation process for either their inputs into the GGE or into the OEWG. And I see that Vladimir Ranunovic has actually asked about that in the questions. So that might also encourage others. But let's turn to capacity building, because you've mentioned it. It's also come up already in some of the questions. I know that the theme of capacity building is dear to both of you, and you're strong advocates for the necessity of capacity building to operationalize norms. So let's start really broad. Where do you see the greatest need for capacity building? Is it at the technical level? Is it at the diplomatic level? I mean, where do you start? It seems like we need capacity everywhere, and every country, no matter how cyber mature it is, needs more capacity. So if you had to choose, where's the greatest need? Pablo, do you want to start? Where's the greatest need?
I mean, the need to develop capacity is one of the few, if not the only, agreement that has been uncontested and has been supported by all sides of the political spectrum. In particular, I am interested in technical capacity, but it is technical capacity for policymakers or technical capacity for network operators. In our view, I mean, if you are talking about cybersecurity, the first thing that you need to work for as part of your development of infrastructure, I mean, you can have all the fiber optic cables and 5G antennas and the most formidable routers and the most formidable equipment. But if you don't have the capable workforce to man, operate, and configure and architect those networks, then that's when sort of your capability is extremely vulnerable. There was a study just in 2013 that in Asia Pacific there is a need for 250,000 capable network operators. There is a shortage of 250,000 network operators. So you can imagine sort of how those networks are in need of capable women and men that deal with them. And at the same time, what we're asking is that they are also understanding of the norms in the political spectrum. So there are all these dimensions of gaps that we need to work for and cover, and they are the key for more stable and secure and reliable networks. I will leave it there, but I have more to say probably after listening to Johanna.
All right, Johanna.
I'm muting instead of unmuting myself. Look, I think it's an impossible question, right? Which community is the most in need? I think I agree with Pablo. If you don't have people trained to understand the issues and to have the technical skills and know-how, then it's a very difficult and uphill path. We, from Australia's perspective, have focused in a number of areas with our cyber cooperation program. So we have a pillar looking at international peace and stability. So this is, I guess, the engagement, the point of context at the political level, international law training, because many governments are looking at, well, how does international law apply in this space? We need to build that knowledge. We do a lot of capacity building around cybercrime. So looking at, do countries actually have cybercrime legislation? Is it illegal within your jurisdiction to do these things? Have you got police who can take digital forensics? Have you got a judiciary that can prosecute and understand the evidence when it's put to them? So looking at it from that full spectrum of activities. We also have a pillar around human rights and digital and inclusive cooperation, and obviously also a technical pillar as well. And underpinning all of this is also recognition of the fact that we need to mainstream gender equality through those programs. So it is a very difficult one, because I think to be able to choose one as being more important than the other, actually there is desperate need across all of these spectrum, all of these activities. And I also just I did just want to point out as well, in terms of the public consultation point, there are other governments that are doing public consultations. I think a really good example is the French government consultations recently around the Paris Call. I saw some publication that came out of that, a summary this morning from the French cyber ambassador. That is not necessarily directly tied to these UN processes, but it is, the Paris Call incorporates many of the GGE norms. So it's not just Australia.
That's true. The UK is another good example that's done a lot on multi-stakeholder consultations. That's very true. I realized that it was a bit of a unfair question, but I did want to ask it. Now, is there? I think this is probably another unfair question, but I'm gonna ask it. I guess that's the moderator's prerogative. Is there one norm in particular that you feel that dedicated capacity building efforts would deliver, like disproportionate benefits? Like, is there a small investment, high return on implementation of one of the norms? Or have you experienced that, a small investment in one of the programs that you've run on the implementation of the norms, where you felt, wow, that was bang for the buck? Could you speak to that? I guess I am asking you to pick amongst your favorite children, right?
I know. Am I allowed to have favorite children? I don't know.
Just
just between us and how many participants, which is easy to forget. This is a great conversation. I feel anyway. I'll have two responses. The first is the one where I've seen the biggest bang for its buck, and the second is where I think we could have the biggest bang for the buck. So we've invested a lot around point of contact. So Australia, Malaysia, within the ASEAN Regional Forum, introduced a proposal for the establishment of ASEAN points of contact database. We then, around that, have done quite a lot of capacity building work and exercises, for example, looking at, well, why do you need those points of contacts? Because I think there is still some skepticism about, well, why do you need a national security point of contact? Why do you need a diplomatic point of contact? And the feedback that we've had within the region has been incredibly positive, that capacity building forced them to go and have conversations domestically, but also to think about, well, what would you do if you had a regional cyber incident that had impact on regional peace and stability? How would you communicate internally, but then also how would you communicate across borders, and how would you harness the private sector? How would you hook into sectoral certs and all of these types of things? So I think in terms of probably one of the most effective capacity buildings that I've seen, that is one where it really you can see the structural changes flowing through many different areas. I think if you had to choose just one norm in terms of capacity building, then for me, the one that would stand out would be protection of critical infrastructure. I think if you can focus on providing clear guidance to countries on what they need to do to protect their critical infrastructure, then that is going to have a big impact. But supply chain vulnerabilities, there are so many there that it's a hard choice. My poor children.
All right, it's a big family, apparently, the 11 children. All right, Pablo, how about you?
I'll be a bit tricky because you didn't mention which of the UN GGE norms is your favorite, and one that I would love to bring to attention is a norm by the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, which is the one about protecting the public core. I mean, there are authoritative services that underpin trust, and it's where the functioning of the internet relies. And if trust in the sense of authenticity and reliability of these services is lost, then we really have a big problem. And these are things like the DNS root service, GUI services, reverse DNS services, registry infrastructure, DNSSEC certificates, and the RPKI infrastructure. I mean, all of these have been cataloged, rightly or wrongly, I don't know. I am not a big fan of the concept of public core because I don't think these services or infrastructure is neither core nor public. But in any case, the point is how to protect those. And I think that's a very core of the technical community for it to be engaged into this. And I will bring here Vladimir's questions here around all these different other processes. And in the Global Commission on Stability, ICANN has been organizing events for diplomats in New York to talk about precisely the trust on and how to preserve and maintain trust on these key services. There is obviously the Tech Accord, the Paris Call. There are all these processes and efforts from Diplo. There are all these efforts as well by the GFCE. And suddenly we have an ecosystem of people thinking about norms and implementation of norms and how to ground those in best practices. And I really think that there is a huge opportunity to converge in this sort of key objective of working towards an open, stable, and secure internet that remains global and that we can trust on. That we have to maintain that trust. It is not like in international relations, you're the part that there is no trust. If there would be no trust on the internet, we wouldn't be talking right here, right now.
that is so true. That is true.
And how we keep that. So let's think about also the normative processes in other venues as well, and how to bring them together.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because some of the questions that we've had have essentially centered on the legitimacy of the 2015 norms and the fact that they weren't, or they took a long time to start to be socialized, which is true. In the interim, there's been, since 2015, a real explosion of other multi-stakeholder or sector-specific, norm generating exercises. And on the one, personally, I'm of two minds about it. Right, I've watched this happen. I was in the back of the room during the process of the GGE, which led to
the front of the room, Kirsten.
Thank you. 2015 norms, and seeing what's happened since then. Part of me says the more the merrier, right? We need, this is a demonstration of how important it is, how critical it is, how we need this engagement from across the board. We need new relationships, we need new ways of working together. That's all great. And then there's part of it on this legitimacy question that I say, well, we forget that the 2015 GGE norms were developed by 25 experts, but then they were the whole General Assembly by consensus. So all UN member states agreed to be guided in their behavior by those norms. So it's no longer just 25 experts in their individual capacity in a room somewhere. All member states have signed on. This is the floor of our international arrangements. It is universal, it's consensus. Now, we can go above that floor, and I hope we do, but it is the common floor amongst all of us. And so when I kind of yammer on about the implementation of these norms, it's not to neglect other suggestions like public core or other important new norms that have been proposed by very illustrious groups. It's just to say that we have some that we have all, as far as I'm concerned, because it's a consensus of all member states, they have enormous legitimacy. And we all have an obligation to seek and capture and do more to implement, as well as to build the capacity to do so. But I could be way off base here. I would love to hear what you guys think about this issue of legitimacy. Do we need to develop new norms? Is there a gap, a normative gap, that we need to go beyond the 11?
Look, I think never say never in terms of new norms. Pablo, I think that the public core norm is a great example, and part of the discussion at the moment is whether or not the public core, which the Dutch are in particular a strong proponent of, could be articulated as a subset of the critical infrastructure protection norm that I was referring to. So I think it's inevitable at some point that we will continue to evolve in the space because the situation continues to evolve. In terms of the legitimacy of the 2015 norms, I think given that, as I said before, they really were capturing best practice rather than being plucked out of the air by the experts, the fact that they have been endorsed by every country in the world through the General Assembly, but also the fact that the Paris Call, for example, picks up on every one of those 11 norms. It adds a couple of extra, public core and electoral security, but it is taking, by and large, word for word, those 11 norms. So I think it's not just that the GGE experts have come up with this and put it out, it's what has happened since then in terms of the consensus around it. In the conversations we're having in the open-ended working group as well, Kirsten and I have had this joke, you could play bingo with how many times delegations said, we're not starting from scratch. So, when you're in that open forum, the floor, as Kirsten describes, is those 2015 norms. Should they be it? No, because the environment that we're working in is a fluid environment. Should we look right now at developing new norms? For me, the question is always, or the way I respond to that question is, look, if I have a choice between putting another couple of norms on a piece of paper or implementing the norms we already have, I would take implementation every time. So my priority at the moment is implementing what we have already agreed.
How about you, Pablo?
Yes, it's a catch-22, because again, there is a huge disparity of language, of understanding, and let's work on these 11 norms. Let's say that that's the start, and that's what we should do. Still, again, I think we need to invent a process to raise awareness and bring all of those that will need to be involved in the implementation of those norms, because even if those norms are for states to follow and agreed by states, eventually there is a lot that you need to communicate, and other actors probably state, but not on the cyber diplomatic front, but in other fronts. And there are other governmental agencies, and there are other non-governmental agencies that need to bring on board in order for these norms to have value. And once you bring them, then you will see probably the way that we define this norm needs a little bit more nuance, or needs a little bit of interpretation. And I can sense the feeling of the room, like, no, you cannot reopen the language of that norm. But on the other hand, I mean, you need to have a process for that norm to be effective. And what would that be? And I think that process is also part of adding these other voices or other normative processes into it, because you're right, Johanna, these norms at the high level can can have sort of, you can hang these other norms that are happening in other venues or tie them or relate them to it. And perhaps those are the keys for that process of implementation. The public core being a subset of the critical infrastructure, for example, or other ones.
That's an excellent point.
And I think a good example exactly of that point, Pablo, is the summary of the consultations that the French put out today. On the fourth page, right down at the bottom, I think it might even be the last point that they make is that of all of the people who responded to their survey, less than a quarter of the organizations that responded to it knew about or were following in any detail the UN discussions. But they have committed and are committed enough to be responding to a survey to implement the Paris Call, which has incorporated many of those UN norms. So I think that is an example of how you can use the communities to ensure that there is implementation that flows.
Yeah. It's obviously what we care about in the end is practical implementation. So
exactly.
Whether people come at it from the Paris Call or the GFCE capacity building or the global commissions, work on norm, what we want is to get them there and discussing it and building the networks. Ultimately, the UN hasn't trademarked cyber norms, and so while it's important that we share this floor of the 11 norms, it is maybe only one door into this conversation. I really regret to say this, but we're kind of running out of time, which is at least hard for me to believe because I haven't gotten through all of my questions. But I would like to give each one of you maybe a 30-second, again, quick kind of a wrap-up opportunity to maybe say something that has surprised you about norms implementation, or something that you would really like to take forward in norms of implementation in your own work or in your own community. So somebody want to start? Pablo, you look like you're ready. You're chomping at the bit there.
Well, it's just bringing back to objectives that I think are widely shared and uncontested, which is working for an open, secure, stable, accessible, and peaceful ICT environment. And even if you operationalize those principles differently in different sectors, and you understand sort of differently what open, stable, and secure internet is in the technical realm and in the sort of political realm, still it's all about working together for global reach and integrity of the network, for it to continue to have a general purpose, for it to be accessible, for working for more connectivity and for end-to-end connectivity. I'm not going to get into the encryption, but permissionless innovation, and all these principles to keep technology neutral and to interoperate through voluntary agreements. It's all about working together for that to happen. And if we are able to breach sort of the misbehaviors with sort of proper defensive and security capacity, with capable people, not only in the most developed economies, but also in the least developed economies, then I think we're on. and what it takes is just a willingness to engage and work together through different sectors, because we're all part of the ecosystem. So if you put something normative in one side of the thing, it doesn't stay in that side of the thing. the internet sort of is an ecosystem.
That's a good point. The ripple effect, spillover effect. Johanna?
Look, I think maybe Pablo and I are reading from the same points, but the key messages for me is when we're talking about these norms, we're talking about international peace and stability. So keep your eye on the end goal in terms of why we are doing this and what the purpose of it is. I think it's also important to remember that the norms are one part of a framework. So we've also got international law, which is hugely important that we haven't even touched on, but which provides very important frameworks in terms of behaviours of states, also confidence building measures and capacity building, which we've talked about. And probably to answer your question of what has surprised me the most out of these processes, as I have really delved into it, it is actually how much norm implementation is already going on. And to just touch very briefly on the question that Florian has put in, does it delegitimize the norms if people are implementing them without knowing that they're implementing norms? I don't think so. I think the point of this is we need these norms capture best practice for an end goal of a peaceful and stable cyberspace. However we get people implementing these is almost irrelevant. We just agree that this is the goal we need to be working towards.
Right. That's I think a great point for us to wrap up on. And this has been a fascinating last hour for me. We've talked about the importance of awareness, the importance of trust, capacity building, the importance of relationships and human capacity, human resources. These are all absolutely critical to getting implementation, the actual practical implementation done. And again, thank you for talking to us about this enabling environment. We're going to have a future webinar where we're going to talk a little bit more about above the waterline, more of the businesses and private sector. But I think it was important that we had this foundation to talk about the technical, the under the water, that we sometimes overlook inadvertently. So on behalf of my security and technology program friends and colleagues, I'd like to thank both of you for sharing your expertise and your good humor with us this evening for you, this afternoon for us here in Europe. I know your time is very precious. I'd like to thank our program sponsors, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, and Microsoft. There are so many great events that have become accessible to all of us during this difficult time, these past few months, things that have moved online. And I know that everyone's time is very precious and you've invested it with us here today. So thank you for choosing to join today's webinar with us. Mark your calendars for the next one in the series. It'll be on the 25th of June at 3 o'clock CET. It's on the theme of cooperation between governments and civil society, using Canada as an example. We'll be pleased also to welcome the chair of the OEWG to that webinar, so it should be a very robust discussion. I also encourage you to take a look at UNIDIR's cyber policy portal. It continues to expand its content. It's a great resource, and when we
it is a great resource.
Thank you. And I also want to say, if any of this captured your imagination, this webinar today has been recorded and it'll be processed and put on the UNIDIR website soon. Lastly, for those of you who thirst for all things digital and it remains unquenched after this time we've spent together, don't forget to tune in to the presentation of the Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation today at 1:30 New York time. It's going to be broadcast on UN Web TV. This is the follow-up to the high-level panel on digital cooperation. So with that, I'd like to thank both Johanna and Pablo. Thank you very much. I wish all of you a terrific rest of the day, and we hope to see you at our next event. Thanks so much.